The cliffs of Cornwall rise like ancient sentinels from the Atlantic. Waves crash against dark rocks worn smooth by centuries of relentless tides. Here, on a windswept promontory called Tintagel, legends and history collide in ways that challenge everything once believed about Britain's most mysterious era. For generations, the period following Rome's departure from Britain carried a name that spoke of collapse and chaos. The Dark Ages. A time when civilization supposedly crumbled, when literacy vanished, when barbarian hordes swept across a defenseless island. A time when, according to legend, a warrior king named Arthur rose to defend his people against impossible odds. But the ground beneath Tintagel tells a different story. The stones speak a language archaeologists are only now beginning to understand. And what they reveal contradicts centuries of assumptions about what happened when Rome fell. The year was 410 AD. For nearly 4 centuries, Britannia had been a province of the Roman Empire. Roman roads connected thriving towns. Bath housed magnificent thermal complexes where citizens gathered to socialize and conduct business. Londinium, the provincial capital, bustled with merchants from across the empire. Villas dotted the countryside, their mosaic floors depicting scenes of Mediterranean luxury transported to Britain's green hills. Coins flowed through a sophisticated economy that touched every corner of the province. Latin mingled with Celtic tongues in markets and government halls. The Roman presence shaped every aspect of life. The army built fortresses that grew into towns. Veterans settled on land grants, spreading Roman culture deep into the countryside. British aristocrats adopted Roman names, wore togas, educated their children in Latin rhetoric. The province produced grain for the empire, wool for clothing, lead and tin for industry. It was integrated into a vast economic system stretching from Hadrian's Wall to the deserts of Egypt. Then the legions departed. Constantine III, a usurper who declared himself emperor in 407 AD, took the last garrison troops to fight his battles on the continent. He crossed the Channel with his army, dreaming of imperial glory. He would die fighting in Gaul just 4 years later. The imperial administrators followed his armies. Tax collectors stopped arriving from Rome. The supply chain that fed and equipped the military garrisons collapsed. Britain found itself suddenly, shockingly alone. The effects were immediate in some areas. Towns that depended on military spending faced economic crisis. The market for luxury goods shrank as wealthy administrators departed. Without imperial mints, the supply of new coinage ceased. But these changes, dramatic as they were, did not mean the end of civilization. What happened next has been debated by scholars for centuries. The traditional narrative painted a picture of rapid decline. Towns emptied as their Romano-British inhabitants fled or perished. The complex economy collapsed as trade routes disintegrated. Germanic raiders called Angles, Saxons, and Jutes swept across the eastern coast, bringing fire and conquest. The Romano-British population either fled west into Wales and Cornwall, were slaughtered in their homes, or became enslaved. Civilization retreated into scattered strongholds while darkness descended across the land. Knowledge was lost. Skills forgotten. The achievements of 4 centuries of Roman rule erased in a single catastrophic generation. This story of catastrophe became deeply embedded in popular imagination. It gave birth to the Arthurian legends that have captivated the world for 1,000 years. A golden age destroyed. A heroic king rising from the ashes. Magic and chivalry in a world teetering on the edge of oblivion. The image of Arthur pulling a sword from stone became a metaphor for restoring order from chaos. But archaeology does not deal in romance. It deals in pottery shards and post holes, in metal residues and bone fragments, in pollen grains and ancient DNA. And the physical evidence from 5th and 6th century Britain tells a far more complex and surprising story than the one found in medieval manuscripts or Victorian histories. At Tintagel, excavations that began in the 1930s and intensified dramatically in recent decades have revealed something extraordinary. Between the 5th and 8th centuries, this remote headland hosted not a barbaric fort or primitive settlement, but a thriving center of power and trade. Over 100 stone buildings clung to the cliffs and terraces. These were not the simple structures of a society in collapse. They were substantial, well-planned constructions that required organization, resources, and vision. Builders had to transport materials to this difficult location. They had to plan layouts that accommodated the challenging topography. They had to coordinate labor and maintain supply lines. The pottery alone tells a remarkable tale. Archaeologists have recovered the largest collection of high-status pottery from the Dark Age period ever found in Britain. These are not crude local wares fired in primitive kilns. They are fine ceramics from the Mediterranean world, objects that traveled thousands of miles to reach this rocky peninsula. Amphorae that once held wine from what is now Turkey. Storage vessels for olive oil from North Africa. Delicate glass cups from workshops in modern France. Ornamental bowls and plates from distant lands across the sea. Each fragment represents a commercial transaction, a ship's voyage, a network of trade that connected Britain to places that had never lost touch with classical civilization. This was not the material culture of a civilization in ruins. This was evidence of continued, even flourishing, international trade. Ships from the Mediterranean were navigating the Atlantic to reach this rocky peninsula. Merchants were conducting business, accepting payment in goods or precious metals. Elites were consuming luxury goods that rivaled anything available during the Roman period. The economic connections that mattered had shifted from overland routes through Roman Gaul to sea lanes connecting western Britain directly to the Mediterranean and Byzantine world. The scale of the finds is staggering. Hundreds of pottery fragments from dozens of vessels. Pieces of glassware that traveled thousands of miles without breaking. Evidence of feasting and display that speaks to wealth and power maintained over generations. The people living at Tintagel in the 5th and 6th centuries were not struggling survivors huddled in ruins of former glory. They were participants in a vast trading network that connected Britain to the wider post-Roman world. They were consuming wine and olive oil just as their ancestors had under Roman rule. The source had changed, but the lifestyle had not collapsed. Similar discoveries have been made across Western Britain, painting a picture of surprising continuity and adaptation. At South Cadbury in Somerset, an Iron Age hill fort was massively refortified in the late 5th century. The defenses that had protected the site in prehistoric times were rebuilt and strengthened. New ramparts were constructed using stone and timber. A great hall was built within the fortifications, a structure large enough to feast dozens of warriors and their retainers. The archaeological evidence suggests a powerful leader took control of this strategic location and invested enormous resources in making it defensible and impressive. This was deliberate state building, the creation of a power center that could control surrounding territories. In Lincoln, once a Roman provincial capital with substantial walls and public buildings, research has revealed continuity rather than collapse. A 5th-century church stood in the center of the old Roman Forum, capable of holding 100 worshippers. This was not a small chapel but a substantial building that required significant resources to construct and maintain. Romano-British pottery continued to be produced and used in the city. The kilns may have been simpler than their Roman predecessors, but they were functional. People were making and trading ceramics. The city did not empty overnight. People adapted to new circumstances. They maintained social structures and religious institutions even as the formal apparatus of Roman government disappeared. The bishops who led these churches were educated men who could read and write Latin. They maintained connections with the broader Christian world. The Wansdyke, a massive earthwork that runs for miles across southern England, appears to date from this period based on archaeological and historical analysis. Its construction would have required coordinating hundreds or thousands of workers over months or years. Trees had to be cleared. Earth moved. Ditches dug. This was not the achievement of scattered warlords fighting over scraps of former Roman territory. This was organized power on a territorial scale, the kind of project that required authority, planning, and sustained resource mobilization. Someone controlled enough territory and people to undertake such an ambitious defensive work. Even more revealing are recent studies using environmental archaeology to understand economic activity. Researchers extracted a 5-meter sediment core from Aldborough in Yorkshire, once the tribal capital of the Brigantes Confederation. This core contained layers of sediment deposited continuously over 1,500 years. By analyzing metal pollutants deposited in these layers, scientists created an unbroken timeline of metal production from the 5th century to the present day. The technique measures lead, copper, and other metals that escape into the environment during mining and smelting operations. The results were astonishing and challenged fundamental assumptions. Metal production did not collapse after 410 AD. It continued at substantial levels. In some areas it actually expanded as British miners and metalworkers filled demand that Roman imperial industry had previously supplied. Large-scale industrial activity persisted well into the 6th century across significant areas of Britain. The sudden crash came not when Rome fell, but around 550 to 600 AD, coinciding with devastating plague outbreaks that swept through Europe and killed perhaps a third of the population. This epidemic, related to the Justinian plague that ravaged the Byzantine Empire, appears to have caused the true economic catastrophe in Britain. This evidence fundamentally challenges the narrative of immediate post-Roman collapse. The Romano-British population did not lose the knowledge and infrastructure for metal working overnight. They maintained sophisticated industrial processes, including mining, smelting, and metalworking, for generations after imperial rule ended. Blacksmiths continued to forge tools and weapons. Bronze workers cast brooches and decorative items. Lead continued to be extracted from British mines. The real catastrophe came later, driven by disease rather than political upheaval or invasion. Agricultural evidence tells a similar story of adaptation rather than collapse. Field systems that had existed since prehistoric times continued in use throughout the 5th and 6th centuries. Open field cultivation, with strips of land held by different families but farmed cooperatively, persisted in many areas. The basic social and economic structures of rural life showed remarkable resilience. People continued to plant and harvest. They raised livestock. They maintained the agricultural cycles that had sustained communities for centuries. Yes, some land went out of cultivation. Some villas were abandoned as their wealthy owners died or departed. But the rural population that formed the backbone of society continued farming. DNA analysis has added another revolutionary layer of complexity to understanding this period. Recent genetic studies of burials from 5th and 6th century Britain show that immigration from continental Europe did occur, but not in the overwhelming waves once imagined. Germanic migrants did cross the North Sea and settle in eastern Britain. But they intermarried extensively with local Britons. Cultural exchange happened through contact and assimilation rather than wholesale displacement or genocide. The material culture changed not because invaders wiped out the existing population, but because styles and practices evolved through interaction between groups. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel from burial sites reveals individuals of mixed heritage buried alongside each other using similar rites and grave goods. Human teeth form in childhood and lock in the chemical signature of the water a person drank. By analyzing these signatures, scientists can determine where individuals spent their early years. The data shows people born on the continent buried in Britain using British-style graves. It shows people of British origin buried using Anglo-Saxon customs. It reveals individuals of mixed heritage buried alongside each other. Incomers became invisible in death because they had integrated into existing communities in life. The neat division between British and Anglo-Saxon that dominates historical accounts simply does not appear in the archaeological record in such stark terms. The written sources that created the Dark Age narrative must be understood in their own context and limitations. The monk Gildas, writing around 540 AD in his work De Excidio et Conquesta Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, was not attempting objective history. His work was a moral sermon condemning his contemporaries for their sins. He portrayed Britain as a land destroyed by vice and divine punishment. His was a theological interpretation, not a factual account of economic and social conditions. He blamed British moral failings for inviting Saxon invasion as God's punishment. His purpose was to call his people to repentance, not to document economic trends or archaeological realities. Bede, writing in the 8th century in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, was creating a religious and political narrative to support the emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Christian church they had adopted. His history served specific purposes in his own time, including legitimizing Anglo-Saxon rule and celebrating the conversion of pagan peoples to Christianity. He drew on Gildas and other sources, but his work was shaped by the concerns of his own era. Neither writer was attempting the kind of evidence-based analysis modern scholars demand or expect. The Historia Brittonum, compiled around 830 AD, and Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th-century Historia Regum Britanniae took fragments of earlier traditions and wove them into elaborate stories. These texts are invaluable for understanding how later generations remembered and mythologized the period. They preserve names, stories, and traditions that might otherwise have been lost. But they cannot be read as straightforward historical documents. They were written hundreds of years after the events they describe, shaped by the literary conventions and political purposes of their own times. This is where King Arthur enters the picture, emerging from the mists of legend and fragmentary sources. The legendary king first appears not as a monarch but as a dux bellorum, a war leader or commander of battles, in 9th-century texts. He supposedly fought 12 battles against Saxon invaders, culminating in a great victory at Mount Badon. This battle is mentioned by Gildas as a real event around 500 AD that brought a generation of peace, though Gildas never names Arthur as the commander. The absence of Arthur from Gildas's account is significant since Gildas was writing within living memory of the battle. The absence of Arthur from early sources has led many scholars to conclude he was entirely fictional. A composite character created from folk memories of multiple leaders who fought the Saxons. A literary invention with no historical basis whatsoever, similar to Robin Hood or other legendary figures. Some scholars argue the name Arthur derives from a Roman military title or family name that became attached to various British war leaders. But the archaeological discoveries at Tintagel and similar sites suggest something more nuanced than complete fiction. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 1130s, claimed Arthur was conceived at Tintagel through the magic of Merlin, who disguised Uther Pendragon to seduce Igraine. He clearly knew Tintagel by reputation as an important place, even though almost nothing remained visible by his time. The site had declined by the 8th or 9th century and was largely abandoned. Yet the memory of its significance persisted in oral tradition for centuries, eventually reaching Geoffrey. The excavations prove that Tintagel was indeed a seat of major power in the 5th and 6th centuries, exactly when Arthur supposedly lived. It was home to rulers wealthy enough to command Mediterranean trade. It was the kind of place where a historical figure of great importance could have resided. Whether that figure was named Arthur or something else, whether he fought the battles attributed to him or not, the material evidence shows that powerful leaders did exist in post-Roman Britain with the resources and authority to command armies and control territories. These leaders controlled kingdoms. They commanded the loyalty of warriors and the resources of agricultural territories. They maintained contact with the wider world through trade and diplomatic relationships. They were not the romanticized knights of medieval legend riding in plate armor and following codes of chivalry that would not be invented for centuries. But they were also not desperate chieftains scraping by in ruins. They were the rulers of societies that, while transformed from their Roman past, remained organized and sophisticated by the standards of early medieval Europe. The kingdom of Dumnonia, which covered Cornwall and much of Devon, appears to have been particularly stable and prosperous during this period. Tintagel sat within its territory, possibly as a royal residence or major administrative center. The kingdom maintained its identity and power well into the 6th century before eventually being absorbed by expanding Anglo-Saxon Wessex. Its rulers had the resources to construct and maintain impressive stone buildings on difficult terrain. They could afford luxury imports from across Europe and the Mediterranean. They maintained courts where bards sang, where warriors feasted, where political alliances were forged. In Western Britain generally, the British kingdoms maintained cultural and political continuity with the Roman past more successfully than Eastern regions. Latin literacy persisted in ecclesiastical contexts. Christian churches and monasteries were founded and flourished. Saint Patrick, who evangelized Ireland in the 5th century, was a Romano-British Christian educated in Latin. The ecclesiastical hierarchy of bishops and clergy that Gildas describes was a Roman inheritance that survived and adapted to post-Roman circumstances. These institutions preserved not just religious traditions but also literacy, Latin learning, and connections to Mediterranean Christianity. The picture in Eastern Britain was different but not necessarily more violent than once thought. Anglo-Saxon settlements certainly expanded through the 5th and 6th centuries in areas like Kent, East Anglia, and along the Thames Valley. But recent archaeological work shows that many Romano-British communities continued alongside incoming groups. Burial practices suggest cultural blending rather than apartheid. Trade goods appear in both British and Anglo-Saxon contexts, suggesting economic interaction. The linguistic transformation of Eastern Britain from Celtic to Germanic languages may have occurred not through genocide but through political dominance and cultural prestige. When new elites took power, speaking their language became advantageous for social advancement. Britons who wanted to participate in the new political order adopted Anglo-Saxon customs, language, and material culture. Over generations, language shift happened through practical choice rather than forced replacement. Similar processes have occurred in many historical contexts where one culture gains political ascendancy without necessarily exterminating existing populations. The HS2 railway project in England, despite its controversies, has produced some of the most significant recent discoveries about this period. At Wendover in Buckinghamshire, archaeologists excavated one of the largest Anglo-Saxon burial grounds ever found in Britain before construction destroyed the site. Over 138 graves contained 141 inhumation burials and 5 cremation burials spanning the 5th through 7th centuries. The grave goods were spectacular and revealed sophisticated craft production and wide trading connections. Over 2,200 artifacts were recovered, including 2,000 beads of glass and amber, 89 brooches of various styles showing changing fashions, 40 buckles for belts and clothing, 52 knives for daily use, 15 spearheads indicating warrior status, and 7 shield bosses from the centers of wooden shields long since decayed. One woman was buried with extraordinary wealth that marked her as a person of very high status. A complete glass bowl possibly dating to the turn of the 5th century, perhaps an heirloom from Roman times carefully preserved. Silver and copper alloy rings adorned her fingers. Brooches and discs fastened her clothing. Iron belt fittings of complex design. Objects made of ivory imported from distant lands. The diversity of material in these burials from the 5th and 6th centuries shows communities with access to luxury goods and sophisticated craft production. These were not people living in desperate poverty as the Dark Age myth suggests. They were members of societies with status hierarchies, specialized craftspeople, and trading connections that brought exotic materials from across Europe. The dead were buried with care and ceremony, accompanied by objects that expressed their identity and status in life. The environmental evidence adds further detail to this picture of continuity and adaptation. Pollen analysis from peat bogs and lake sediments shows that agricultural land was not abandoned en masse. Some fields reverted to pasture or scrub, suggesting a shift in farming practices, possibly in response to climatic cooling around 500 AD known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. This climatic downturn may have made grain cultivation more difficult in marginal areas. But there was no wholesale return to wilderness. People continued to farm, to manage landscapes, to maintain rural economies at substantial scales. Animal bone assemblages from settlements show continuity in livestock management practices. Cattle, sheep, and pigs remained the primary domesticates as they had been for centuries. Butchery patterns indicate that some Roman practices in meat processing continued into the post-Roman period. The diet of ordinary people did change as access to Mediterranean imports like wine and olive oil decreased outside elite contexts. People ate more porridge and less bread as milling declined in some areas. But local food production remained robust and adequate to sustain populations. The truth about Dark Age Britain is that the darkness was never as complete as once believed. Yes, major changes occurred after 410 AD that transformed British society in fundamental ways. The urban culture of Roman Britain did decline significantly outside major centers. Towns shrank. Some were abandoned entirely as their economic rationale disappeared. The sophisticated market economy that had distributed goods across the province faltered without Roman administration and military demand. Skills like large-scale stone quarrying, kiln-fired pottery production at industrial scale, and glass manufacturing were temporarily lost in some regions as the specialists who possessed them died without training successors. But Britain did not revert to primitive barbarism. Societies reorganized around different structures that combined Roman traditions with older Celtic patterns. Kingdoms emerged that drew on both Roman administrative concepts and pre-Roman tribal confederations. Fortified hilltop sites like South Cadbury became power centers again as they had been in the Iron Age. Christianity provided cultural continuity and maintained connections to the Roman past through Latin liturgy and learning. Trade routes shifted but did not disappear entirely, with Western Britain maintaining connections to Gaul, Iberia, and the Mediterranean through Atlantic Sea lanes. The people of 5th and 6th century Britain were not living in a dark age of ignorance and chaos. They were navigating a period of profound transformation. Old certainties had vanished. The protective umbrella of imperial power was gone. But humans are remarkably resilient and creative. They adapted to new circumstances. They built new societies from the materials at hand, both literal and cultural. They maintained what they could of the past while creating new forms appropriate to changed conditions. The material culture changed because people's circumstances changed in specific, understandable ways. Without imperial mints producing standardized currency, coin use declined and barter economies expanded. Without large-scale industrial pottery production, people made simpler wares or used wooden vessels that leave less archaeological trace. Without state-organized stone quarrying, buildings were constructed from wood and thatch rather than stone and tile. These changes reflect adaptation to new economic and political realities, not civilizational collapse into ignorance. Regional variation across Britain was enormous during this period, far greater than under Roman rule. What happened in Lincoln was quite different from what happened in Cornwall. The experience of communities in Kent differed dramatically from those in Wales. Any single narrative of this period inevitably oversimplifies a complex reality. The reality was messier, more varied, more interesting than tales of universal decline or heroic resistance. It was a time when local circumstances and individual choices mattered more than imperial directives. Modern archaeology, with its scientific techniques and sophisticated theoretical frameworks, has revolutionized understanding of this period over the past few decades. Radiocarbon dating provides precise chronologies that earlier scholars could only guess at. Stable isotope analysis reveals individual life histories, showing where people were born and what they ate. Ancient DNA connects people across time and space, revealing migration patterns and family relationships. Environmental archaeology reconstructs past landscapes and climates with remarkable precision. These tools allow questions to be asked and answered that earlier generations of scholars could never have approached with the methods available to them. The myth of the Dark Ages persisted for so long partly because it served useful narratives for later periods. It exaggerated the break with Rome, making the Anglo-Saxon conquest seem more complete and transformative. It emphasized the triumph of Germanic Anglo-Saxon culture as the foundation of English national identity. It provided a dramatic backdrop for romantic legends like Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Scholars and popular culture found the narrative of collapse and rebirth emotionally satisfying in ways that messy continuity could never be. But history is not obligated to be dramatic or emotionally satisfying. The truth is often more ambiguous, more contingent, more human in scale than legends allow. The people of post-Roman Britain were neither doomed victims of inevitable collapse nor heroic archetypes standing against the darkness. They were individuals and communities making choices, facing challenges, experiencing joys and sorrows that archaeology can glimpse but never fully recover. They worried about harvests and illness. They celebrated marriages and mourned deaths. They told stories and made art. They lived lives that mattered to them even if history forgot their names. As for King Arthur, the question of his historical existence may be ultimately unanswerable with available evidence. The sources are too fragmentary, too distant from the events they purport to describe, too obviously shaped by later concerns. The legends grew over centuries, accumulating details that have no historical basis. Magic swords, round tables, holy grail quests, and courtly love were medieval additions to whatever kernel of tradition may have existed. Separating fact from fiction is perhaps impossible at this remove in time. But the context in which the Arthur stories developed was emphatically real. 5th and 6th century Britain was home to powerful leaders who defended territories, who fought battles against Saxon expansion, who ruled kingdoms and commanded warriors. Whether one of them was actually named Arthur, or whether that name became attached to the memories of several different figures, the archaeological record confirms that such leaders existed. They left their mark on the landscape in fortifications and settlements. They commanded enough resources to import Mediterranean luxuries. They were remembered in oral traditions that eventually crystallized into legend. Tintagel stands as testament to their power and the reality behind the myths. The high-status pottery speaks to their wealth and international connections. The stone buildings demonstrate their ambition and organizational capacity. The trading networks prove their continued engagement with the wider world even as the Roman Empire fragmented. These were not mythical figures in a timeless legend existing outside history. They were historical actors in a specific, documentable period whose material remains can be excavated and analyzed. The work continues as archaeology is an ongoing process of discovery. Every excavation adds new pieces to the puzzle. Every scientific analysis refines understanding and challenges old assumptions. The period once dismissed as a dark age of ignorance is becoming one of the most intensively studied in British archaeology. Scholars recognize that these centuries are crucial for understanding how Britain transitioned from Roman province to the medieval kingdoms that would eventually coalesce into England, Scotland, and Wales. The findings have implications that extend far beyond academic history. They remind us that civilizations do not simply end in cataclysmic collapse. They transform. They adapt. Elements persist even as others change beyond recognition. The continuities matter as much as the disruptions in understanding historical processes. People endure through catastrophes, carrying forward knowledge, traditions, and identities even as circumstances shift around them. The lesson of Dark Age Britain is that human societies are more resilient than we often imagine. On the cliffs of Cornwall, the wind still howls across ancient stones as it has for 15 centuries. Archaeologists continue to excavate, to analyze, to piece together the lives of people who died so long ago. New techniques promise new discoveries. Ground-penetrating radar reveals buried structures without excavation. Genetic analysis connects individuals across generations. The past continues to yield its secrets to patient investigation. The legends of King Arthur will endure because legends speak to human longings that transcend historical fact. They express hopes for heroic leadership in dark times, for justice triumphing over chaos, for meaning in the face of loss. These stories will continue to be retold and reimagined because they serve psychological and cultural needs that mere facts cannot satisfy. But the real history of Dark Age Britain, revealed through patient archaeological investigation, is in its own way more remarkable than any legend. It is the story of human resilience in the face of profound disruption. Of adaptation when old certainties crumbled. Of communities maintaining their identities and building new futures amid profound uncertainty. It is the story of real people in a real time that was neither as dark nor as simple as once believed. The era of King Arthur, whether he existed as an individual or not, was not a lie or a void. It was a period of transformation when the foundations of medieval Britain were laid. The archaeological evidence reveals a Britain that was complex, connected, and remarkably vital despite tremendous challenges. The darkness lifted not because it was imagined, but because modern science has learned to read the traces left in earth and stone, in DNA and pollen, in metal residues and pottery sherds. The story continues to unfold with every new discovery that emerges from British soil. The past refuses to stay buried beneath myth and assumption. And the people of 5th and 6th century Britain, dismissed for so long as living in darkness and barbarism, emerge into the light as full historical actors whose achievements deserve recognition and whose struggles resonate across the centuries to our own time of transformation and uncertainty.